So, drum and bass. This is the favourite section of mine in the history and progression of urban rhythm. It's taken me the longest of all of the modern forms to be able to play. I'm very proud to be able to do it and to represent the UK, to represent Britain, because this is an English form that started in this country and all the innovators were either in London, Bristol or Birmingham, and that's where everyone was. The key record that if you've not heard it, go and listen to it. It's amazing. The innovation came from a Bristol collective called Represent that were headed by a guy called Ronnie Size. He was using early sampling. The album won a Mercury Music Prize in 1997. It's called True Forms. It's amazing. So out of drum and bass started in the early 90s and it was a dance music, basement dance music culture. It was in London and Bristol almost predominantly, and then it also moved into Birmingham. By this album that came out in 97 was a game changer, and it changed the way that everybody looked at it. But at that time, it wasn't seen as something that you could play live on a drum kit. And then the session musician Clive DEAMER, who was previously in Portishead and other famous bands in that period, was brought along by Ronnie Size, taken into his little studio. And this guy was a jazz drummer and a session drummer, played on a lot of pop music in the UK. And DEAMER just played a whole series of different rhythms. And I've gone back into that album many, many, many times. There's a track called Morse Code. There's another track called Mad Cat. Check those out. They're mental. What's interesting about it and what makes it so difficult as a thing to be able to learn and do is they layered it up. So if we go back to our Amen break and you take the last two bars of the Amen break, that's what people like Goldie, Groove Rider and Dillinger were doing, is they were either making them on drum machines, 808s or whichever was the machine that they had, and or they were sampling the Amen break sections, slices of different rhythms that they found on records. What we're dealing with here is cut-up technique. Cut-up technique is now going to relate to everything else we do in this series of lessons. It's a very difficult thing to learn, and yet actually when you know the secret, it's quite straightforward. We're literally looking at the rhythm like a line, and then we're going to take sections out of it and rework them in a linear form of improvisation to create rhythms that have this multi-layered element to them. If you imagine in your mind's eye, seeing as we've all had computers in our lives for a long time now, imagine in your mind's eye a computer screen with waveforms on it. We're thinking like that. So what we're doing is taking these little slices of waveform and rearranging them in the same way as David Bowie back in the day took lyrics, cut them up, put them in a different order to create something surreal, and that was his song. We're doing exactly the same with rhythm. So what I'm going to do is this is fast as well. Original drum and bass started at 140 BPM and then it went up from there. It came out of, in the late 80s and 90s, it came out of jungle and techno, which they had never had anything to do with drummers because you couldn't then, nobody really could do that. It was just insane, so fast. And now a lot of drummers who have spent a lot of time on this, like myself, you're looking at BPM between 140, 180, even up to 200 BPM. But that comes later, that just takes a lot of practice. What I'm going to show you is I'll break down the second half of the Amen break again. I'll explain to you why that's significant, how you can cut it up, which bits are useful. I'll then show you repeats on one bit and how that works. I would suggest then that you just watch what I do at the end, because there's not going to be any further way for me to explain the secrets behind this. It's cut-out technique. You take the notes, you rearrange them, and you have to be improvising. It's the closest to jazz. And the interesting thing about that is Clive DEAMER was originally, as I said, a jazz drummer. So Ronnie Size was sampling a jazz drummer and then layering him 3 or 4 times with little sections that he liked on his computer and creating new rhythmic forms out of one guy's playing, which is very cool. So I'll play you the second half of the Amen break. Jungle I'm going to do at the end. It's just faster. You have to think quicker and you have to, it's just a breakneck speed. So I'll do that at the very, very end. But I'll do this explanation now. So a lot of it was recorded on the ride cymbal. I brought this cymbal along specially. This is part of my Istanbul endorsement. The Turk is the driest ride cymbal that they do, and it's perfect for this. And DEAMER used ride a lot, so Ronnie Size was cutting up a lot of stuff with ride in it. Since then, a lot of players have used a lot of hi-hat, and I like using hi-hat too, but that's where it started really, because it was jazz being chopped into pieces. So I'll start just by playing the proper Amen break slowly, and I'll show you the little bits that we're going to cut up, and then I'll show you a rearrangement of those bits, and then we'll go from there. Right, the open hi-hat bit at the end, we don't need that. So we're going to take that away and just the bare bones of the 2 bars, just the ride cymbal. The placement of the notes is what, literally of those 2 bars, is what started people thinking like your Goldies and Groove Riders and Dillingers. That's what they were thinking, this. It's putting notes in a jazz position, it's putting them in a very off position to create an angular, aggressive rhythm that's constantly changing. And you imagine lots of South Londoners in hot, sweaty clubs getting down to this all night. And it was an innovation in rhythm. It was a revolution in rhythm at the time. So the pieces that I think are really important, the least important part is the double downbeat. That truly relates to hip hop. This is the least important part. And in fact, when I give myself an in, and that's useful, the in for me is a single downbeat. I'll do that again. This is my in, and I try and change it, but I find that this gets me into the flow. One more time, slowly. Because of the placement of those notes, that helps me in. The double that we took out of the hip hop, you really use in drum and bass. So that's this. And what I've done is I've taken the offbeat snare drum before it, and I've taken just that sliver, and I repeat it. What I notice in a flow of drum and bass is the repetition, is the fact that you can imagine somebody creating this music, liking that particular repetition of notes and wanting that to keep flowing. So one of my favorite bits is this. And then stuff as simple as a single bass drum. You want it to sound human, but you also want to pay reference to the fact that it's a mechanical type form. It wants to sound a little bit like a machine, bearing in mind that it was a machine that translated a human being's drumming and then through sampling turned it into something alien sounding. So you want to try and replicate that by repeating parts, sections of these little grooves. And then there are other ones that I think, this is one of my secret ones that I use all the time, which again is parts of the second 2 bars of the Amen break rearranged, and that's this. end up with something like this. I'll just do a little bit. The secret is in which pieces you take, which sections you choose. And I've found that in teaching this to my advanced students over the last year and a half, 2 years, you've got to be really specific. And if you do it right, you'll end up with your own style in it. So currently I'm teaching 4 people to do this in an extreme form, and everybody sounds different from each other and me. So everyone's picking pieces that they like, and it's almost like making your own digital painting out of your own physical playing. And then how you choose to improvise that defines the sound of your drum and bass drumming. And it's very, very exciting. It's a very hard journey. It's one which takes away any jokes about drummers not being bright people, because you really have to think about this and be focused and improvising at the same time. This draws the strongest parallels, which I often talk about in my lessons, between martial arts and drumming, or athletics and drumming, or extreme sports and drumming. It's that focus. You have to have that clear focus to follow the line and keep following it and keep following it. This drum, the DF custom drum, which I had made by RT Customs by Rich, has the most amazing side stick sound, and that's something else that's really good in drum and bass. I'll just do a little section of that using again these little slivers and cut ups. So that's also worth using. Side stick on any snare drum will sound really good. Do it on this one. So you get different sounds from different side stick on different snares. That can be extremely pleasing. If you're playing around with a hi-hat, don't be scared, which I've said many times to my students, don't be scared of a straight line of hi-hats. You need spaces in it as well. If you're presenting a listener with so many notes, you have to present them with the spaces and even silences. I do a lot of stops, and I hear a lot of stops in the records that I was referring to, because the spaces between the notes, even at high speeds, and the silences are as important as the actual notes. In fact, in some cases, they're more important. So when I run a line of hi-hats, it's because I want to give the listener time to digest what they've just heard in terms of the conversation that I've had between the bass drum and the snare drum. And that's really important. I cut holes in the ride cymbal playing for the same reason. So I'll suddenly do a repeat. There's a phrase maybe that's happening on the snare drum, and then I'll do a repeat in the ride cymbal, and I'll cut spaces into it on purpose to give a breath. Otherwise, it's impossible to follow. And something that I don't like seeing in current drum videos that I see on Vimeo, YouTube, et al., is too many notes. If you're trying to present to people something like this, you've got to give them the spaces to be able to breathe. Otherwise, they just can't take it in. I think that about covers it. This has been the drum and bass section. I'm going to do an outro performance that also includes jungle, which is pretty much just faster. It's got a higher sort of barrage of notes. It comes at you much quicker. So I'll probably go in drum and bass and then curl up to jungle. I'll play around between the hi-hat and the ride cymbal, probably just between these two snare drums. Few fills, few little tricks that I use, and then just enjoy, you know, going away and trying to do it. It's not easy. Just work on it. You'll enjoy it eventually. And see you on the next one.